Welcome to the Discover Bittensor podcast. My name is Nick, and the objective of this podcast is very simple: to help normal people understand Bittensor. I think something pretty important happened over the last month in the Bittensor ecosystem, and not just because the price of TAO went up, but in the story. We might have seen, because it's not really sure that this was the actual cause, but we might have seen a kind of breakout moment, a subnet that became more or less famous outside of the Bittensor ecosystem. And the market reacted. And I think that gave us a glimpse of something much bigger. What happens if the world starts noticing that inside Bittensor there are dozens of tiny, early, fascinating startup economies, and that if you want to invest in them, you actually need to buy TAO first? Because Bittensor's mechanics route TAO into subnet reserves in exchange for subnet alpha, and creating a subnet also requires TAO. Well, this may sound pretty technical, but it basically means that in order to acquire the token of a subnet, one has to buy TAO. And this is very fundamental, and we'll have a look at this mechanism in this episode. I still think that many people look at Bittensor and see AI crypto, but they may actually be looking at something much stranger, something more like a public market for very early AI and infrastructure experiments. And if that is true, then the relationship between subnet success and TAO could become far more important than most people realize. So let's start with this breakout subnet, which is called Templar. So what happened to Templar? Well, last week, subnet 3 got a lot of attention. And the reason is actually pretty simple. So imagine that most big AI models today are built like giant secret machines inside the warehouses of a few huge companies, like OpenAI, for example. Now imagine a group of people saying, what if we try to build one of those giant machines together, over the internet, in a decentralized way, without one company controlling the whole thing? And that's basically what made Templar interesting last week. So actually, Templar published a message that they've successfully trained a 27 billion parameter model, I believe, if I say this correctly. This is the largest decentralized model training effort ever, I believe. So a widely shared, I believe, X post about this achievement crossed roughly 1.1 million views, which is very big for Bittensor because Bittensor is still extremely small, extremely unknown, I would say. Now, whether Templar ultimately wins or not is not the point. The point is that this is the kind of achievement people can suddenly understand. They may not understand validator emissions or alpha pricing, subnet mechanics, but they do understand this. Wait, are you saying a decentralized network just trained a really big AI model? That makes the subnet ID feel real. And it makes Bittensor feel less like an abstract token system and more like a place where serious experiments are actually happening. And I think that matters a lot. So, what happened with TAO? Over roughly the last month, TAO moved from about $140, $150 mid-February to around $290, I believe yesterday or so. So basically in 1 month time. That's a huge move. Most of the acceleration came very recently, from roughly $200 or a few days ago to about $292 yesterday. And importantly, TAO also strengthened meaningfully against Bitcoin over that same period. So this was not just a story of Bitcoin going up and everything else being dragged along behind it, like very often. And that matters. Because when anything rises in crypto, the lazy explanation is always Bitcoin went up, therefore everything went up. And yes, Bitcoin still matters. Liquidity still matters. Risk appetite still matters. But when TAO also strengthens against Bitcoin, then you have to at least consider that something more specific is happening. And, well, no one knows. It might just be random, That's very much an opportunity. But imagine the following case. People actually got interested in Templar because they all saw this post. Then they discovered, hey, I can invest in it because it has a token. But to obtain this token, I have to buy TAO. Okay. And again, I really don't know if this is what happened. But what we saw is that Templar, the price of Templar went up, I think, 2x or so also in a few days' time. So, well, it might be related. We don't know yet, but it's an interesting thought experiment, an interesting thesis to discover, to explore. Like, what happens if some of these subnets become known outside of Bittensor, and people suddenly want to invest in their token? And as I mentioned before, it's basically baked into the code of the Bittensor protocol that if subnets succeed, the TAO price also has to succeed. So that's what I want to discover, to explore in this episode. Because in a lot of crypto ecosystems, the base layer token and the ecosystem tokens are only loosely connected. That's one of the reasons people often compare Bittensor favorably to Ethereum's layer 2 world. Because Ethereum is very important, obviously. It secures the base layer, it settles things. But if one layer 2, like Arbitrum, or one app on Ethereum becomes exciting, that does not necessarily create a clean, direct, unavoidable line back into ETH. And in Bittensor, this connection is much more powerful. If you want exposure to a subnet, you typically need to go through TAO first, because TAO is what enters the subnet reserve in exchange for subnet alpha. And, this is another thing, if you want to create a new subnet in the first place, there is a TAO burn cost. And that makes TAO much more than just the token of the protocol. If Bittensor works, TAO becomes the gateway asset into a growing landscape of subnet economies. And that is why subnet success matters a lot. Because if a subnet becomes really interesting, not just to speculators, but to actual builders, actual users, actual investors, then demand for exposure has a more direct route back into TAO than in many other ecosystems. Again, nothing is guaranteed, but structurally, the link is much, much more interesting and much more powerful than in basically all or almost all other crypto projects. Now, I want to mention something I find very fascinating personally. The total price of the subnet layers, also called sum of subnets, is about 1.33 or so TAO at this moment. And that matters because many people looking at that chart believe the aggregate subnet layer likely found a bottom somewhere near 1 TAO back in late 2025, I believe in November. The chain actually prevents the sum of subnet price from going much lower than 1. That's the idea, and it's no guarantee, but I think many people would agree that this mechanism does exist and does help. And this is probably what we saw back in November 2025, because the sum of subnet prices bottomed at a little bit below 1, I believe 0.99 or so. And then actually the chain started to buy up a lot of these subnet tokens, I believe. Maybe it's a bit more technical than this, but in general, this is the idea. So we went from sum of subnets 1 to 1.3 more or less in a matter of months. This is very interesting because Bittensor and Bittensor subnets are still almost completely unknown by the outside world, okay? So the question is, what happens if many people want to buy subnet tokens? Because suddenly the world wakes up to all these interesting projects within the Bittensor ecosystem. In my opinion, nobody really knows where the long-term value of the subnet layer goes. And nobody knows whether that area really was the final bottom in November. But what's so interesting is this. In theory, this is like mathematical or like in the code of Bittensor. There is no obvious upper limit to what the sum of subnets could become if enough of these subnet economies become desirable. So that does not mean it must go up forever. It doesn't mean every subnet matters. It doesn't mean that every project survives. It just means that the total value of the subnet layer is still a very open question. And if more and more people begin to see subnets as investable, startup-like assets, then that total value could change dramatically. Like, I'm not going to do any price predictions in this podcast, but what I try to explain is this. No one knows if the sum of subnets can go to 2, to 5, to 10, to 20. No one knows. It's just the truth. This is something we'll discover in the coming months and years. So very interesting. But the fact that there's no mathematical maximum on the sum of subnets is very interesting, because it means that in theory, if a subnet token has a huge demand, its value, which is denominated in TAO, all the subnet values are denominated in TAO, could actually reach 1 TAO. In theory, I'm not saying this is going to happen. But the biggest subnet token, the biggest subnet at this moment is Shoots, and it's 0.09 TAO, its price. Let's say 0.1 is easier. It means with 1 TAO that you stake into the subnet, you obtain 10 subnet tokens of Shoots, okay? But what if many people want to obtain this token and the price of Shoots goes up to like 1 TAO? Then very strange things might start to happen, in my opinion. And it's very interesting to think about this topic. So why does this matter for retail? Well, I think this is another piece I think is underappreciated. The average retail person knows that AI is going to be big. But for most people, the real upside of frontier AI has mostly lived inside private companies and private funding rounds. OpenAI is private, Anthropic is private as well. Most of the major AI value creation has happened behind closed doors, funded privately, long before normal people can participate. And that means the normal person often ends up in a strange position. They can clearly see that AI is becoming one of the biggest technological shifts in the world, but they cannot really invest directly in most of the companies driving that shift. And that's where Bittensor becomes unusually interesting. Because if Bittensor attracts enough attention, it may become one of the first places where retail says, I can't get exposure to the private AI giants, but I can get exposure to an open ecosystem of AI and decentralized experiments. Now, that does not make it safe or easy, and it definitely doesn't mean that every subnet is a good investment, but structurally, it's a very different model. Instead of waiting for a company to IPO after most of the upside is already captured privately, retail can allocate capital into subnet economies much earlier. That's a radical difference, and it's almost a political difference. It's a way to democratize investing, actually. And this is much more profound. This is much broader than just AI. This is actually a very deep topic, because this issue applies to other startups as well. Like, you need to be an accredited investor in order to invest in very early stage startups to capture all the upside. And once they go public, then most of the upside has already been gone, basically. So this is also why Bittensor by some people is considered a breakthrough, because it's, as far as I know, the first initiative to actually democratize investing to the world. And I think it's fair to say that it comes close to the political changes that Bitcoin actually proposed to the world. So let's get back to the subnet, because this is where things get exciting. Because Templar is not alone. Ridges, for example, is another subnet, which is building a platform where AI agents solve software problems end to end. They just published their, or they just made their product available to the public. Very, very interesting. And why? Because it's a very ambitious attempt to move from AI coding assistant towards something close to an AI software worker. And who knows, maybe Ridges or another one might one day rival Claude Code or Codex with a fraction of the cost to develop the product. Another one is Hippias, offering decentralized cloud infrastructure, like basically a decentralized version of Dropbox, with hundreds or sometimes even thousands of times lower costs than major centralized providers. Zeus is building a weather forecasting API on Subnet 18 and argues that its subnet architecture can outperform strong baselines by continuously rewarding the best forecasters across the globe. And beyond those, the ecosystem keeps getting more interesting. There are subnets experimenting with agents, model training, inference, storage, compliance, scientific forecasting, media, and various forms of infrastructure. So yeah, again, not all of them will survive. Probably most won't, but that's not the point. The point is that what is happening inside Bittensor increasingly looks like a public arena where many early digital startups are competing in real time, and almost nobody outside a small circle is paying attention yet. So, what are the realistic bullish scenarios here? Not fantasy, not everything goes times 100 because blah blah blah. Just realistic opportunities. I think there are different scenarios. Like the first one, a small number of subnets become credible enough that outsiders start valuing them like startup experiments rather than random crypto tokens. We've seen this with Steelcore Capital, the fund run by Mark Jeffrey, amongst others. They've invested in Targon, Hippias, and Ridges, I believe. And maybe others will follow. And this matters because once people stop seeing them as weird side coins and start seeing them as early experiments in decentralized businesses, capital behavior changes. Scenario 2. One or two subnets become meaningfully better or cheaper than centralized alternatives. Think Ridges again with its coding agents. And that's how infrastructure usually breaks out, because something becomes obviously useful. And if decentralized storage gets much cheaper, if weather data gets much better in certain regions, if training, inference, or agent infrastructure becomes materially compelling, then adoption can start for very boring, very practical reasons. The third scenario, retail wakes up to the idea that this may be one of the few open markets for early AI exposure. And that to me is one of the most powerful possibilities. Because the average person knows AI will matter, they just usually cannot access the early upside directly. So if Bittensor becomes the place where retail feels it can finally get exposure to dozens of AI and infrastructure experiments, what does that do to TAO? Because remember, if people want subnet exposure, they usually need to come through TAO first. Scenario 4. The sum of subnet layer gets repriced. If the total subnet layer really did find a likely bottom near 1 TAO in late 2025 and is now around 1.3 to 1.35, then the obvious next question is not what is fair value, because nobody knows. The obvious next question is what happens if the world starts buying these subnet economies aggressively? What happens if investors begin treating them like a liquid basket of AI and infrastructure startups? What happens if the total subnet layer goes from being mostly ignored to being widely studied? That's where the sum of subnet ID gets fascinating. Because in theory, that value has no clear upper bound, as I mentioned before. Only market appetite, only utility, adoption, and attention. And be careful here, because I think one of the most likely scenarios is also that retail is gonna discover this, and we'll see a lot of traders actually trading these tokens, like we see right now on Solana, for example. And I don't know if this is actually a good thing, but I think this is a scenario. Now, the last topic for today's episode. Can TAO decouple from Bitcoin? This is a big question. My answer is partially yes, fully probably not anytime soon. In the short and medium term, TAO is still a crypto asset, even though, as some people within the Bittensor ecosystem confirm, like it doesn't have that much to do with crypto. It's just that crypto was the most obvious infrastructure layer, if you will, to create this ecosystem on. But the reality is, it trades in crypto markets, and it's affected by Bitcoin. It's affected by liquidity conditions. It's affected by fear and greed. So I would not pretend Bittensor is about to become some perfectly isolated economic island. But partial decoupling is a serious possibility. Because if enough real value starts being created at the subnet level, and if enough subnet revenues begin supporting their own token economies, and if enough capital starts flowing into Bittensor specifically because of subnet opportunities, then some portion of TAO demand becomes ecosystem specific, and that's the key. The more internal economic gravity the subnet layer creates, the more TAO can start trading on its own fundamentals. Not entirely, I think, but increasingly. And if that happens, TAO may begin to behave less like just another altcoin, and more like the monetary base of a growing internal startup economy. So that's the framework I would leave you with. I just covered a few of the possible scenarios. I have no clue which scenario is going to be the right one. I think no one really knows. And maybe there are even more scenarios possible. But I think these scenarios are pretty likely, or some of them, to play out. So we'll see. And I think Templar last week was not just a pump, it was a glimpse. The TAO move was not just price action, it was a signal. And the deeper story is that subnet success may feed back into TAO much more directly than most people realize. Because if people want exposure to these little startup economies, they have to come through TAO first. And if the world starts discovering that inside Bittensor there are dozens of early investable AI and infrastructure experiments, then the question is no longer just will one subnet win? The question becomes, what happens to TAO when the whole subnet layer starts being taken seriously? And that, to me, is one of the most fascinating questions in crypto right now. And I do think we'll get an answer to that question this year. So let's see. Well, that's it for today. For more information on Bittensor, have a look at my website, discoverbittensor.com. And thanks again for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye bye.